In the town of Larkspur, in the town of Larkspur Hollow, Minnesota, there stood a mill that had ground flour for 3 generations of the same family. The Hedstrom family mill sat beside a slow brown river, its water will turning the way it had turned since 1891. By 1974, the man running it was Walter Hedstrom, a broad-shouldered fellow of 31 who smelled permanently of wheat dust and machine oil. At our Hollow, Minnesota, there stood a mill that had ground flour for tea. Walter had inherited the mill from his father the way his father had inherited it from his father before him. As a boy, Walter had spent every summer afternoon beside his father, Elias, learning to read the color and texture of wheat, the way other children learn to read books. Elias used to say that a mill only survived if the man running it respected 2 things above all else: the grain and the river that turned the wheel. Neither could be rushed, and neither forgave carelessness. Walter carried that lesson with him long after his father was gone. He did not think of himself as a businessman. He thought of himself as a miller, plain and simple, a man who turned grain into flour and sold it to bakers and grocers within 40 miles of home. He worked 6 days a week. He closed early on Sundays for church. He kept his accounts in a leather ledger with a pencil that never left his shirt pocket, and he distrusted anything that smelled of a shortcut. The man who changed everything for Walter was not a relative and not a friend of long standing. He was a grain elevator accountant named Otis Pruitt, a quiet, precise man who came by the mill every autumn to settle accounts for the co-op. Otis had spent 30 years balancing the books for farmers who never had $2 to rub together, and in that time he had developed strong opinions about money that he rarely shared unless asked. He had a habit that puzzled Walter. He read financial magazines the way other men read the sports pages, and he kept a small notebook of numbers that he guarded like scripture, filling its pages with figures that meant nothing to anyone but him. One October evening in 1975, over coffee in the mill office, Otis asked Walter a simple question. He asked what Walter did with the money left over after the bills were paid. Walter admitted that whatever was left sat in a savings account at the town bank, earning almost nothing. Otis set down his cup and told Walter about something called an index fund, a plain, unglamorous way of owning a small sliver of hundreds of American companies at once, without having to guess which ones would win. Walter was skeptical. He said he trusted flour and grain, things he could touch and weigh. Otis smiled and said that trust was exactly the point. He said a person did not need to be clever to grow wealthy. A person only needed to be patient, to keep buying steadily, and to refuse to sell when the world seemed to be ending. He said the market would test that patience more than once in a lifetime, and the ones who stayed quiet through the testing were the ones who ended up rich, usually without anyone else noticing. Walter began setting aside a portion of the mill's profits every single month, rain or shine, flood or drought. He did not tell his wife the exact figures. He did not brag at the feed store. He simply kept buying the same modest amount month after month, the way he kept the water will tur. The first real test came in October of 1987. The stock market fell harder in a single day than anyone in Larkspur Hollow could remember, and the newspapers Walter read at the diner counter used words like collapse and panic. Farmers who had put money into the market pulled it out in a hurry, certain the whole system was crumbling, telling anyone who would listen that they had saved themselves just in time. Walter drove out to see Otis, who was by then retired and fishing most days down at the river bend. Otis did not even look up from his line. He told Walter the mill did not stop grinding wheat just because the sky looked dark, and neither should his money stop working. He said the men selling in a panic that week would spend years trying to explain away the decision, and the ones who did nothing at all would never have to explain anything. Walter went home and made his usual deposit into the fund, the same modest amount as every other month, and he did not mention the conversation to a soul. By the time Walter's daughter Margaret grew up and married a schoolteacher, and by the time their own daughter, Ingrid, was old enough to sweep the mill floor after school, Walter had quietly become one of the wealthier men in the county, though nobody, including his own family, had any idea. He still wore patched overalls. He still drove a truck with more rust than paint. Ingrid was the one who took to the mill the way Walter once had. She loved the rhythm of the grinding stones and the smell of fresh flour, but more than that, she loved her grandfather's Sunday afternoon habit of sitting on the porch with his old leather ledger, now supplemented by a plain manila folder full of statements, explaining to her, patiently, without any hint of showing off, how compound growth worked. He would draw simple lines on the back of a feed receipt to show her how a small, steady sum, left alone for decades, could quietly outgrow almost anything flashier. He told her the same thing Otis had told him. Stay steady, stay patient, and do not let fear make your decisions for you, because fear was loud and patience was silent, and only one of them ever built anything worth keeping. Ingrid was 22 and newly in charge of the books when the year 2000 arrived and the technology stocks that everyone had been chasing came crashing down. Neighbors who had gambled on flashy new companies, certain they had found some clever shortcut to riches, watched those fortunes disappear in a matter of months. At the diner, talk turned bitter, full of blame and regret. Ingrid, trained by her grandfather since she was old enough to hold a pencil, kept the mill's modest, unglamorous index fund contributions exactly the same month after month, while panic swept through people who had believed they were smarter than the market. She never once mentioned to her friends what she was quietly doing with the mill's spare earnings, mostly because none of them ever thought to ask a flour miller's granddaughter about investing. Walter passed the daily running of the mill to Ingrid not long after, though he still walked down every morning to check the water wheel out of habit, standing there with his coffee as the sun came up over the river. In 2008, the second great test arrived, larger and uglier than the first. Banks failed. Neighbors lost homes. The evening news showed grown men weeping outside shuttered brokerage offices. And the price of wheat itself swung so wildly that even the mill's ordinary business felt shaky. Ingrid, now 30 years old, sat in the same mill office where her grandfather once sat with Otis, and she remembered his voice telling her that the market would try to scare her out of her own good sense. Her husband, worried, suggested they pull their savings out and wait for calmer water. She did not sell a single share. She kept buying, quietly, the same modest sum, while others around her sold everything they had at the worst possible moment. Out of fear rather than reason, Walter Hedstrom died peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 2019, at the age of 76, having spent his entire life in the same small house 200 yards from the mill. He left behind no visible signs of wealth. His truck was worth perhaps $800. His clothes filled a single closet. The following year, in the early spring of 2020, a virus swept the world and the stock market fell faster than it had in 1987, faster than in 2008. Schools closed. The mill itself nearly shut down for lack of orders from restaurants that had gone dark overnight. Ingrid, now raising her own son at the mill and watching the news with a knot in her stomach every evening, felt real fear for the first time in her investing life. She thought seriously of selling, if only to sleep through the night without worry. She sat up late one evening with her grandfather's old leather ledger in her lap, the one he had kept since the 1970s, and she found, tucked into the back cover, a note in his careful, slanted handwriting that she had never noticed before. It said simply that panic was a poor advisor and that patience had never once failed a Hedstrom. She wiped her eyes, closed the ledger, and kept buying. Within 2 years, the fund had not only recovered but had grown larger than she had ever imagined possible. And she never mentioned that frightening night to anyone but her own son. Years later, it was not until the reading of Walter's will, 3 years after his death, delayed by a dispute over a small parcel of land bordering the river, that the full truth came out. The family lawyer, a careful woman named Dorothy Kessler, sat Ingrid and her mother Margaret down in a plain office above the hardware store, papers spread neatly across the desk, and read the figures aloud in a flat, unhurried voice, as though she were reading a grocery list rather than a fortune. The account that had begun with modest monthly deposits back in 1975, the account nobody but Walter and Otis Pruitt had ever known the size of, had grown to just over $4,100,000. Margaret wept quietly into a handkerchief. Ingrid sat very still, thinking of her grandfather's patched overalls and rusted truck, of the thermos of black coffee he carried down to the water wheel every single morning of his life, and understanding for the first time the full weight of the quiet discipline he had practiced every single month for 44 years without ever once explaining himself to the town. Walter's will left specific, careful instructions, written in his own hand years earlier. A portion was set aside to modernize the mill, so it could keep running for a fourth generation, replacing worn belts and aging grindstones with equipment that would carry the business another century. The remainder, nearly $3 million, was to establish the Hedstrom Grain Scholarship, funding agricultural and trade education for young people from Larkspur Hollow and the surrounding farm towns, the kind of practical, unglamorous education that had built the mill in the first place and that Walter believed the world too often overlooked. The dedication ceremony held beside the old water wheel that autumn, with the leaves turning gold along the riverbank. Ingrid stood before the assembled townspeople, many of whom still could not quite believe that quiet Walter Hedstrom, a man they had known only in patched overalls, had been sitting on a fortune the entire time. She held up the old leather ledger, its pages soft with age and its cover worn smooth from decades of handling, and told them what her grandfather had told her, and what Otis Pruitt had told him before that. Wealth, real wealth, was rarely loud. It never announced itself at the diner counter or the church picnic. It was built one patient month at a time, by ordinary people willing to keep grinding, keep buying, and keep believing, long after everyone else had grown tired of waiting and stopped paying attention. The water wheel turned on, the way it always had, the way it always would, patient and unhurried, grinding out something valuable from ordinary grain, one quiet turn at a time.